The kingdom of Illyrion had one rule that mattered more than blood, more than birthright, more than family name. Magic decided everything, and by that rule, the heir of the mightiest mage house alive was already dead weight. Nobody in the Asterie mansion knew the truth yet. They watched a sickly young master kneel in the dirt of the herb garden every single morning, digging up weeds with his bare hands, and they whispered that he had finally lost his mind. What they could not see was the invisible ledger only he could read, ticking upward, with every root he pulled, every leaf he bruised. He was not mad. He was leveling up a power no mage in that world had ever heard of. And soon, the man everyone had already written off as a failure would hand the most feared patriarch in the kingdom a gift that should not have been possible. But to understand how far he would climb, we have to go back to the day he fell. The Asterie family ruled through fear as much as respect. For 6 generations, they had produced the strongest battle mages the kingdom had ever seen. Men and women who could level a hillside with a flick of the wrist. Every child born into that house was tested at 7, tested again at 10, and tested a final time at 13, when their mana was supposed to fully awaken. Pass, and you were groomed for greatness. Fail, and you became a shadow in your own home. Lion Asterie had failed 3 times. Servants in the East Wing didn't bother lowering their voices anymore when they talked about him. One maid told another, just past his door, that a boy who couldn't even light a candle with magic had no business calling himself an Asterie. Another added that his own father barely looked at him at family dinners. None of them said it to his face. They didn't need to. The silence at the table did that job for them. Lion had stopped expecting warmth from that house months ago. What scared him now wasn't the disappointment. It was the calendar. Fail heirs weren't simply ignored in this family. They were quietly removed from the succession line, stripped of protection, and left to survive however they could, usually badly. He had seen it happen to a cousin 2 years older than him. That cousin now worked as a low-ranked clerk in a border town nobody visited. He was not going to end up like that. Not if he could help it. What none of them knew, what none of them could ever guess, was that the boy on his knees in the mud was not entirely the person he used to be. His name, before all this, had been Baek Yi-hyun. He had been an office worker in a gray, exhausting city that never seemed to sleep. Long nights, longer meetings, a boss who treated deadlines like personal insults. One evening, after a shift that stretched 14 hours, Yi-hyun quit on the spot, walked home in the rain, and did the only thing that still felt like his own choice. He opened an old game he used to love, one he hadn't touched in years, and built a character from scratch. He didn't build a warrior, he didn't build a mage, he built a gatherer, a crafter, someone who leveled up by picking herbs, mining ore, and brewing potions instead of fighting monsters. It was slow, it was quiet. After a life spent being screamed at by clients and supervisors, slow and quiet sounded like heaven. He never got to enjoy that character for long. A few weeks later, exhaustion caught up with him in a way his body couldn't recover from. He closed his eyes in his small apartment and didn't expect to open them again. When he did open them, he was 7 years old, kneeling in a garden he didn't recognize, wearing clothes far too fine for a boy who used to eat instant noodles over his keyboard. It took him days to understand what had happened. The world around him wasn't just similar to his old game. It was that game, decades after whatever story it used to tell had already played out, filled with real people who bled and grieved and lied to each other the way real people always had. He had been reincarnated as Lion Asterie, the family's second son, already marked as its greatest disappointment. The first time he tried to open his old character menu out of pure habit, more than half expecting nothing to happen, a faint blue panel flickered in front of his eyes. Numbers, skills, an achievement list with his own name, already filed under Gatherer, apprentice rank. His crafting system had survived the jump with him. Nobody else in that world could see it, not his tutors, not the healers who examined him after each failed mana test, not even the strange white bird that liked following him through the back garden. Only Lion could read the little notifications that blinked into existence whenever he pulled a rare herb from the soil or ground 2 ingredients together in a stone mortar. To everyone watching from outside, he simply looked like a boy pulling weeds and occasionally grinning at nothing, which did very little for his reputation. He decided early on that reputation didn't matter anymore. Surviving did. If magic would never open a path for him, he would dig one with his own hands instead. The garden became his classroom, He learned which plants glowed faintly gold when his system marked them as rare, invisible to anyone standing beside him. He learned that harvesting the same patch too often lowered the yield, so he mapped out new patches across the estate grounds, moving like a man with somewhere important to be, even though most days his only destination was a patch of ordinary-looking clover. 3 weeks into this routine, his notifications started giving him something new. Coins. Not real coins from the kingdom's treasury, but system currency, tied to a shop only he could open, filled with recipes and tools locked behind price tags he couldn't yet afford. He didn't care that most of it was out of reach. He cared that the number in the corner of his vision kept climbing, proof that something in his life was finally moving forward instead of standing still. Sylvia, the mansion's head housekeeper, noticed the change before anyone else did. She had served the Asterie family for over 20 years, long enough to remember Lion's father as a boy himself. She'd watched Lion grow from a quiet, easily startled child into someone who barely spoke at meals, and she'd assumed, like most of the staff, that his spirit had simply been worn down by 3 failed awakenings. Then the weed pulling started. At first she thought it was some strange method a healer had suggested, maybe grounding exercises for a fragile mind. When she asked one of the mansion's physicians, the man only shrugged and admitted he'd prescribed no such thing. After that, Sylvia began watching Lion more closely, standing at a window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, while the young master knelt in the exact same corner of the garden for the 3rd morning running, occasionally staring at empty air with an expression of quiet satisfaction. She started to worry it wasn't grounding at all. She started to worry his mind had genuinely begun to slip. She never said this to him directly. She wasn't cruel enough for that. But she began leaving small gifts near the garden bench, a blanket on cold mornings, a cup of warm milk, gestures aimed at a boy she quietly feared was breaking apart under pressure. Nobody else in that house bothered to notice. Lion caught the pattern of her kindness fast. He didn't correct her assumption, not yet. Explaining an invisible system to a woman raised entirely within the rules of magic and bloodline felt like a fast way to end up locked in a healer's chamber instead of a garden. So he let her worry, quietly grateful that at least one person in that enormous house seemed to care whether he lived or starved. His actual goal was simpler than anyone guessed. He needed money, and he needed it without depending on a family that had already begun mentally filing him under disposable. The system's shop offered exactly the kind of independence he wanted, if he could ever afford to unlock it properly. Advanced seeds, better tools, recipes for potions that sold for absurd prices in the kingdom's cities. All of it sat behind price tags built for someone several levels above where he currently stood. So he did what any patient gatherer would do. He kept working. Weeks folded into each other. His notifications piled up. Novice herbalist, novice gatherer. Each one nudged his level forward, and each level nudged the shop's locked items a little closer to affordable. He started noticing rarer plants tucked into corners of the garden nobody bothered tending, patches that glowed faintly for his eyes alone, ordinary weeds to everyone else on the estate. One overcast afternoon, elbow deep in a bed of pale blue flowers most gardeners considered a nuisance, Lion realized he had enough saved currency to unlock something new, a basic alchemy set. Nothing fancy, just a mortar, a set of vials, and a starter recipe book that appeared instantly in his inventory the moment he confirmed the purchase. He sat back on his heels and stared at the small wooden case that had folded itself into existence in his lap. The first tangible proof that his invisible progress could turn into something real he could hold. That night, alone in his room, he brewed his first proper potion. It came out cloudy and useless, and his system flagged it with a blunt failure notice that stung a little more than he expected. He tried again the next night, then the night after that. On the 5th attempt, the liquid in the vial turned a clean, pale green, and a soft chime rang out in his mind, the kind of sound he hadn't heard since his old life, back when clearing a difficult crafting recipe used to feel like the best part of his day. Novice alchemist, the notification read. He allowed himself one small, tired laugh in the dark, the first genuinely happy sound that room had heard from him in weeks. Word about his strange habits eventually reached beyond the garden. A stable hand mentioned to a cook that the young master had been seen crushing herbs late into the night, muttering under his breath like a man rehearsing something. The cook mentioned it to a maid. The maid mentioned it to Sylvia, embellished just enough to sound alarming, and by the time the story finished circulating through the servant halls, it had transformed into a rumor that Lion was preparing some kind of farewell ritual, quietly getting his affairs in order before doing something drastic. Sylvia heard that version and felt something cold settle in her chest. She confronted two of the maids responsible directly, voice sharp enough that both women flinched. She reminded them that spreading unfounded claims about a member of the family, however troubled he seemed, was not something she would tolerate under her watch. One of the maids apologized immediately. The other rolled her eyes the moment Sylvia turned away, muttering that everyone already knew the boy was finished anyway, talent or no talent. Word of that particular comment reached Patrick Asterie by the end of the week. Patrick, patriarch of the entire Asterie line, was not a man who tolerated disorder inside his own walls. He had built the family's reputation through decades of ruthless discipline, and he expected that same discipline reflected in every servant, every heir, every corner of the estate that carried his name. He summoned Lion the moment he heard the boy was becoming a subject of gossip, intending to settle the matter quickly, one way or another. Lion received the summons with a knot forming in his stomach. He knew exactly what a meeting like this usually meant for someone in his position, a formal acknowledgement that he'd fallen behind, possibly the first real conversation about removing him from the succession line altogether. He'd expected this moment to come eventually. He simply hadn't expected it this soon, and definitely not before he'd had time to prepare anything worth showing for himself. So he made a decision that would have looked reckless to anyone who didn't know what he was capable of. He delayed. He sent word back through a nervous attendant that he needed a little more time before presenting himself, phrasing it as respectfully as he could manage. Patrick, a man used to being obeyed instantly, sat in his study reading that message twice, genuinely startled that the same heir everyone considered broken had just asked him to wait. He nearly summoned guards to drag the boy in immediately. Something made him hesitate instead, a small, unfamiliar curiosity about what exactly his failing grandson thought was worth delaying a direct order for. Lion used every hour of that borrowed time in his workshop. He'd noticed something during his last 2 rounds of testing his potions, an odd interaction between 2 specific herbs he'd found deep in an overgrown corner of the estate, one that produced an effect his recipe book didn't list anywhere. Curiosity mixed with desperation, and he began experimenting late into the night, grinding, mixing, discarding failed batches, chasing something he couldn't name yet, but somehow trusted his system to recognize once he found it. On his final attempt before he ran out of stalling time, the liquid in his vial shifted to a deep, calm blue, and his system lit up with a notification unlike anything he'd seen before. New recipe discovered. Potion of mental clarity. He stared at the small vial in his hand, warm from the last stage of brewing, and felt something settle into place. Whatever this potion actually did, his instincts told him it mattered. He didn't fully understand the value of what he was holding. He only knew, deep down, that presenting Patrick with empty hands would have been a mistake. Presenting him with this felt like the only real chance he had. He capped the vial carefully, tucked it into his coat, and finally sent word that he was ready to be summoned. What he didn't know yet was that the moment he stepped into that study, everything Patrick believed about his failing grandson would begin, slowly and reluctantly, to come apart. Patrick's study smelled of old parchment and cold ash, a fire long since let die out because the patriarch found comfort in the chill. He sat behind a broad oak desk, covered in reports from every branch of the family's holdings, and when Lion stepped through the door, he did not look up right away. He let the silence stretch, a habit he used on everyone who entered that room, testing how long they could stand it before their nerves cracked. Lion had learned patience the hard way, first in a cramped office cubicle, under a boss who thrived on exactly this kind of pressure, and later in a garden where results took weeks instead of minutes. He simply stood and waited. That, more than anything, was what made Patrick finally raise his eyes. He studied the boy in front of him, noting the faint calluses beginning to form on his palms, the dirt still faintly ground into the creases of his knuckles despite an obvious attempt to scrub them clean. Not the soft, useless hands he expected from a failed heir who spent his days moping in his room. Patrick's jaw tightened. He asked, in a voice carved from years of command, why his grandson had dared to delay a direct summons. Lion answered honestly. He said he had been trying to finish something worth bringing, rather than arrive with nothing but apologies. Patrick's eyes narrowed further. He reminded Lion, coldly, that he already knew what the boy had to offer. 3 failed awakenings. No magical output whatsoever. A reputation among the staff that had grown embarrassing enough to reach even his own study. He asked what exactly a boy with no talent thought he could possibly bring that would matter. Lion reached into his coat and set the small blue vial on the desk between them. He explained, plainly, that he understood he would likely never awaken conventional mana. He said he had accepted that reality months ago, and instead of continuing to chase something that clearly wasn't coming, he had spent his time learning something else entirely, a craft nobody had bothered teaching him, because nobody believed he was worth the effort. He told Patrick this potion was the result, made specifically with him in mind, meant to ease the mental strain that came from decades of carrying the family's weight alone. Patrick stared at the vial for a long moment without touching it. Something about the boy's tone unsettled him more than any excuse or plea for mercy would have. There was no begging in it, no desperate attempt to prove magical worth he didn't have. Just a strange, quiet confidence that had no business existing in a boy everyone in this house had already given up on. He told Lion, flatly, that he doubted a potion brewed by an untrained hand could do anything at all for a mage of his standing, let alone touch exhaustion that had settled into his bones over 40 years of rule. Still, he didn't dismiss the boy outright. He simply told him he could go, and that the matter of his place in the succession would be decided another time. Lion bowed and left without another word, his heart hammering the entire walk back to his room, uncertain whether he had just wasted his last real chance or planted something that might actually grow. Patrick sat alone with the vial long after the door closed. He turned it over in his fingers, studying the way the liquid inside caught the light, a shade of blue he didn't recognize from any alchemist's work he'd seen in decades. Skepticism told him to set it aside and forget the entire conversation. Something else, some small curiosity he couldn't quite explain, made him pull the stopper free instead and drink it down in a single motion, almost daring it to fail so he could close the matter for good. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the tension that had lived behind his eyes for as long as he could remember simply lifted. Like a hand he hadn't noticed, pressing down on his skull had finally let go. The dull ache that flared every evening, after long hours of reviewing reports and settling disputes between lesser houses, faded into nothing. He sat perfectly still, waiting for it to return the way exhaustion always did, and it never came back. He set the empty vial down on his desk, with a hand that was not quite steady. 40 years of accumulated strain, the kind he'd stopped believing any healer or tonic could touch, had simply gone quiet. He sat in that cold study long after midnight, staring at nothing, turning over the uncomfortable question of how a boy with zero magical talent had produced something his own family's best alchemists had never managed to create. Meanwhile, the rumors in the servants' halls had taken on a life of their own. By the following morning, the story being whispered in the kitchens no longer resembled anything close to the truth. One version claimed Lion had been overheard discussing his own death. Another insisted he'd been seen crying over the garden bed the night before, muttering apologies to no one. A particularly cruel telling suggested he was distributing small gifts to the staff, a farewell gesture, before doing something none of them wanted to say aloud. Sylvia caught wind of this final version from a young maid who repeated it with wide, frightened eyes, and something in her snapped. She marched straight to the servants' quarters that same afternoon and demanded to know exactly who had started the claim. 2 names surfaced within minutes, both maids who had clearly enjoyed embellishing a story they knew nothing about. Sylvia didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice, quiet and absolutely final, informed both women that they were dismissed from service, effective immediately, and that spreading cruel fictions about a member of this household, however troubled they assumed him to be, would never be tolerated under her watch. Neither woman argued. Something in Sylvia's expression made clear that arguing would only make things worse. Word of the dismissal spread through the mansion almost as fast as the original rumor had. For the first time, the remaining staff began to reconsider whether mocking the young master so openly was still a safe habit to keep. Patrick summoned Lion again 3 days later, this time with none of the cold detachment from their first meeting. He asked Lion directly how the potion had been made, and whether he could replicate the effect. Lion explained as much as he safely could, describing the herbs involved without revealing the invisible system guiding every step, framing his knowledge as something self-taught through careful trial and long nights of experimentation. Patrick listened closely, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions that suggested he was testing for lies rather than simple curiosity. He found none. Eventually, Patrick called for Sylvia and asked her to bring the family's magical analysis tools, instruments capable of reading the residual energy signature left behind in a crafted item. When the results came back, Patrick sat in silence for a long moment, reading numbers that didn't match anything a first-time alchemist should have been capable of producing. Sylvia, standing beside him, admitted quietly that the pattern reminded her of old records describing craftwork attributed to legendary heroes centuries past, figures whose creations had shaped the outcome of wars before fading from history entirely. Patrick dismissed the comparison out loud almost immediately, calling it an absurd leap for a boy who couldn't even light a candle with magic. But neither of them fully believed their own dismissal, and the thought lingered in the room long after they'd both agreed to set it aside. It was in that same meeting that Patrick finally revealed what he actually wanted. He told Lion, in a voice quieter than the boy had ever heard him use, that there was someone in this family who mattered more to him than the entire estate combined. His younger sister, a woman who had fallen into an unnatural sleep centuries earlier, kept alive only through the family's oldest protective magic, unreachable by every healer who had ever attempted to wake her. He said he had stopped believing anyone could help her years ago. Then he set the empty vial on the desk between them and asked, plainly, whether Lion believed he could create something strong enough to try. Lion misread the weight in Patrick's voice for a moment, his mind briefly leaping to an entirely different assumption about the nature of Patrick's concern for a woman close to him, an assumption the system flatly corrected the instant it registered the mistake, flashing a small clarifying note only Lion could see. He blinked the confusion away and focused back on the real question sitting in front of him. He didn't know if he could actually succeed. He said so honestly. He also said, without hesitation, that he was willing to try. Patrick studied him for a long moment, the same way he might study an unfamiliar report crossing his desk for the first time, searching for the trick, the flaw, the reason this shouldn't be trusted. He found nothing except quiet resolve in a boy he had written off months earlier. That resolve was the only thing keeping Lion upright once he left the study, because the moment he was alone again, the full weight of what he'd just agreed to settled hard against his chest. He opened his system that night and searched the shop for anything that might help him produce a potion strong enough to reach centuries of unnatural sleep. Every promising recipe carried a price tag far beyond what he currently had saved, some by staggering margins. Ingredients he'd never heard of, tools locked behind ranks he hadn't come close to reaching yet. One requirement kept repeating across nearly every high-tier recipe he examined. Superior gathering equipment. His current tools, simple and worn, were holding back both the quality and yield of everything he harvested, quietly capping his progress, no matter how many hours he spent in the garden. He needed better tools, and he knew exactly where those tools were made. The kingdom's finest blacksmith lived and worked at the edge of the estate's western district, a gruff dwarf named Mudu, whose forge had supplied weapons and tools to the Asterie family for 3 generations. Lion had passed that forge 100 times without a single reason to enter it. Now it was the only door left standing between him and any real chance of finishing what he'd promised. He arrived at the workshop early the next morning, coat still smelling faintly of garden soil, and asked to speak with the master smith directly. Mudu emerged from the back of the forge, wiping soot from thick forearms, squinting at the finely dressed young noble standing awkwardly near the entrance. He'd heard the same rumors as everyone else in the district, whispers about the Asterie heir losing his mind somewhere out in that garden of his, and he made no effort to hide his skepticism as Lion explained what he'd come for. He expected the boy to ask for a commission, something expensive, purchased with family money, and forgotten within a week. Instead, Lion asked to use the forge himself, to make his own harvesting tools with his own hands. Mudu laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. He told Lion that noble sons didn't dirty their hands at an anvil, and that whatever game this was, he didn't have patience for it today. Lion didn't argue or explain himself further. He simply asked if he could watch for an hour, quietly, without getting in the way. Something about the plain, stubborn request made Mudu pause. He'd turned away plenty of arrogant customers over the years, and this wasn't how arrogance usually sounded. He grunted, waved a thick hand toward a stool in the corner, and told the boy he had exactly 1 hour before he'd be thrown out regardless of his last name. Lion sat quietly and watched the forge work, cataloging every motion with the same focus he used to bring to complex crafting guides in his old life. He noticed things Mudu's own apprentices sometimes missed, the precise angle of a hammer strike, the timing of quenching a blade at exactly the right moment. He also noticed something none of the dwarves in that forge seemed aware of at all. Tucked into the deepest corner of the workshop, half buried beneath a pile of scrap metal, a small flickering shape pulsed weakly, a dim orange light struggling to hold its own form. Lion's system flagged it instantly with a soft chime only he could hear, marking it as a weakened fire spirit, its vitality dangerously low. He asked Mudu, carefully, whether the forge had a spirit bound to it. Mudu's hammer paused mid-swing. He turned to study the boy with narrowed eyes, suddenly far more serious than he'd been a moment earlier. He asked how exactly Lion knew that, since the spirit hadn't shown itself properly to anyone in the workshop for nearly a year, its presence reduced to nothing but occasional flickers in the forge fire that most of the younger smiths had simply stopped noticing. Lion admitted, honestly, that he could somehow see it, weak and fading in the corner, though he couldn't explain why he was the only one who seemed able to. Something shifted in Mudu's expression, skepticism giving way to a wary, calculating curiosity. He'd heard old stories about spirit-bonded craftsmen, rare individuals capable of communicating with the elemental forces bound to forges and workshops, though he'd never expected to meet one standing in his own shop, let alone one wearing an Asterie family crest. He asked, more quietly this time, whether Lion thought he could help it. Lion didn't know for certain. He said he was willing to try, the same answer he'd given Patrick days earlier, and somehow it carried the same weight here as it had in that cold study. Mudu made him a deal on the spot. If the boy could genuinely restore the forge's fire spirit, he would personally teach him blacksmithing from the ground up, priority given above every other apprentice currently under his roof. Lion accepted without hesitation. He spent the rest of that day back in the garden, hunting through his system's recipe list for anything related to spirit care, eventually uncovering a nearly forgotten formula for a nourishing oil built from 3 specific herbs, one of which he'd only ever seen glowing faintly near the estate's oldest, most neglected flower beds. He gathered everything he needed by evening and spent half the night grinding and blending under lantern light, chasing a result his system seemed to recognize as important, even before the final mixture came together. By the time he returned to the forge the following morning, exhaustion had carved dark circles under his eyes, but he carried a small clay jar of pale golden oil like it was worth more than anything else he owned. Mudu watched with arms crossed as Lion knelt beside the weakened spirit and carefully worked the oil into the scattered embers where its faint shape still flickered. For a long moment, nothing happened, and doubt crept back into the dwarf's expression. Then the flickering light steadied, brightened, and slowly rose into a small, human-like shape made entirely of warm orange flame, no larger than a child, blinking at Lion with something like relief. Mudu stumbled back a step, staring at a spirit he hadn't seen at full strength in over a year. He turned to Lion with an expression that had completely abandoned its earlier skepticism, replaced by something closer to reverence. He kept his promise from that day forward, treating Lion not as a noble playing at hobbies, but as a genuine partner worth investing real time and effort into. Mudu wasted no time putting Lion to work. The very next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall of the district, the dwarf handed him a leather apron 2 sizes too large and told him to forget everything he thought he knew about nobility while he stood at that anvil. Lion pulled the apron over his coat and said nothing. He'd expected exactly this kind of treatment, and honestly, after months of quiet dismissal from his own family, being barked at over something as simple as hammer grip felt almost refreshing. The first lesson had nothing to do with fire or metal. Mudu made him carry buckets of water back and forth from the well for nearly 2 hours, muttering that soft, noble hands needed calluses before they'd ever be trusted near a blade. Lion's arms burned by the end of it, but his system quietly logged the effort anyway, awarding a small trickle of experience toward a novice blacksmith track that hadn't existed in his menu until that exact moment. He caught the notification out of the corner of his vision and allowed himself a tired smile Mudu completely misread as simple exhaustion. The fire spirit, now fully restored to its small flickering form, took an immediate liking to him. It hovered near his shoulder whenever he worked close to the forge, occasionally darting into the flames to stoke them hotter the moment Lion needed it, a courtesy it extended to absolutely no one else in that workshop. John, Mudu's younger brother and closest assistant, noticed the pattern within the first week and started half-jokingly calling Lion the forge's favorite, though there was a genuine curiosity behind the teasing that never quite faded. John turned out to be the easiest person in that entire district to get along with. Where Mudu barked instructions like a drill sergeant, John explained things patiently, walking Lion through which coals burned hottest, how to read the color of heated metal to judge its temperature without needing a single tool. He didn't ask prying questions about the family Lion came from, which made the long hours at the forge feel less like an obligation and more like something Lion actually looked forward to each morning. Learning to actually shape metal turned out to be far harder than gathering herbs ever had been. His first attempt at a simple harvesting hoe came out warped, the head twisted at an angle no farmer could have used without breaking their wrist. Mudu didn't spare his feelings about it, tossing the ruined piece into the scrap pile with a flat comment that even his newest apprentices managed better on their first try. Lion melted it back down and started again. His second attempt cracked entirely during quenching, the sudden temperature change splitting the metal clean through. His third came out closer, structurally sound but ugly, uneven along the edge in a way that would have dulled fast under real use. He kept going. Somewhere around his ninth failed attempt, exhaustion had settled so deep into his shoulders that his hands had started to shake slightly between strikes. Mudu, watching from across the forge, told him plainly that he could stop for the day, and nobody would think less of him for it. Lion shook his head and reached for another bar of raw metal instead. It was on his 11th attempt, hands trembling and vision blurring slightly at the edges from lack of sleep, that his hammer finally found the right rhythm, striking at precisely the angle John had been trying to teach him for days. The metal folded cleanly. The edge came out even. When he plunged it into the water for quenching, the hiss of steam sounded almost satisfied. A soft chime rang through his mind an instant later. Novice blacksmith unlocked, the notification read, and beneath it, a small line confirming his very first successfully forged tool. He didn't get much time to celebrate the moment. His legs gave out right after, the accumulated fatigue of days without proper rest finally catching up all at once, and he collapsed against the workshop wall before John could even reach him. He woke hours later in an unfamiliar bed, soft blankets pulled up to his chin, the smell of something savory cooking nearby. Mudu's home, attached to the back of the forge, turned out to be small and cluttered, and warmer than anywhere Lion had slept since arriving in this world. Mudu's wife, a stout dwarf woman, with flour permanently dusted across one forearm, scolded him the moment he sat up, telling him no tool was worth working himself half to death over. Their two children, barely old enough to reach the workbench, had apparently spent the last several hours arguing over which of them got to sit closest to the strange noble boy sleeping in their guest room. When Lion finally emerged to eat, both of them peppered him with questions about the mansion he lived in, whether nobles really ate gold for breakfast, whether he'd ever seen a real dragon. He found himself laughing for the first time in longer than he could remember, answering their increasingly ridiculous questions between mouthfuls of stew that tasted better than anything the Asterie kitchens had ever served him. It was a strange thing, sitting at that cramped table surrounded by a family that owed him nothing and expected nothing beyond honest company. Nobody at that table cared whether he could awaken mana. Nobody there had ever once called him useless behind his back. For a few hours, he simply got to be a tired young man who'd forged his first tool. Nothing more complicated than that. He returned to the forge the following morning fully rested, and Mudu, apparently satisfied that the boy had earned it, agreed to help him finish the hoe properly this time, guiding his hands through the final refinements neither of them could have managed alone. The fire spirit, hovering close throughout the entire process, pressed itself briefly against the finished blade the moment it cooled, leaving behind a faint golden shimmer that hadn't been there before. Mudu examined the result with open surprise, turning the tool over in thick fingers. He told Lion that a spirit-blessed tool was rare, even among master craftsmen with decades of experience, and that whatever bond the boy had formed with that flickering little creature, it wasn't something that could be taught or bought. Lion tested the hoe in the estate's garden that same afternoon, and the difference showed immediately. Patches of soil that used to yield a single usable herb now revealed 2 or 3, plants previously hidden from his system's perception, suddenly glowing faintly gold the moment the blessed blade broke the surface near their roots. Harvesting that used to take him half the morning now took a fraction of the time. The tool carried one unexpected quirk nobody had mentioned during its creation. While clearing a patch near the garden's edge, Lion accidentally struck a buried sweet potato with the hose blade, and the fire spirit's blessing reacted instantly, wrapping the vegetable in a brief shimmer of heat before it popped free of the soil, already perfectly roasted, skin split and steaming. Lion stared down at the accidental snack for a long moment before laughing quietly to himself. The small absurdity of it, a welcome break from the tension that had followed him for weeks. The white bird that had taken to following him through the estate grounds swooped down immediately and claimed the roasted potato before he could decide whether to eat it himself. Progress from that point moved faster than it had in months. With the blessed hoe in hand, Lion's harvesting yield climbed steadily, each session in the garden producing better ingredients than the last. His system's shop, once filled with items far beyond his reach, slowly opened up as his gathered currency grew. Recipes and tools he'd only been able to look at longingly, now finally within grasp. He spent every spare hour cross-referencing his growing ingredient stock against the requirements for a true high-grade potion, the kind Patrick's sister would actually need. Most recipes still demanded materials he hadn't located yet, rare plants that grew only in specific conditions he'd need to search for well beyond the estate's familiar grounds. Sylvia noticed the toll this search began taking on him almost immediately. She'd started tracking his comings and goings more closely since the incident with the dismissed maids, partly out of genuine concern, partly out of a curiosity she hadn't quite admitted to herself yet. When Lion returned from a 3-day excursion into the forest bordering the estate, arms scratched from thorny undergrowth and eyes hollow from exhaustion, she met him at the garden gate with a look that mixed worry and something close to awe. She didn't scold him the way she once might have. Instead, she simply asked, quietly, whether he genuinely believed he could pull off what Patrick had asked of him. Lion told her honestly that he didn't know for certain. He said that not trying wasn't something he could live with, not after everything Patrick had risked by trusting him at all. Something in that answer settled deep into Sylvia's chest. She'd spent weeks assuming the boy's strange behavior stemmed from a mind slowly breaking down under pressure. Standing in front of her now was someone entirely different. Someone who'd apparently chosen the hardest possible path available to him, and walked it without complaint. She began quietly gathering information of her own after that conversation, discreetly asking around the estate's oldest historians about any past records mentioning craftsmen capable of the things she'd started noticing in Lion. Most inquiries led nowhere. A few old texts mentioned something closer to legend than history, stories about wandering heroes centuries past who had appeared briefly during moments of great crisis, always gifted with impossible skill in ways nobody could ever fully explain, always vanishing again once their purpose had been served. She mentioned this to Patrick late one evening, in the same cold study where he'd first tested that unremarkable blue vial. Patrick listened in silence, turning the same worry over in his own mind that he'd been quietly carrying since the day he'd examined that potion's strange energy signature. He admitted, finally, that the thought had crossed his mind more than once, and that it frightened him more than he wanted to say aloud. He told Sylvia that if Lion truly carried something connected to those old legends, the kingdom's other great houses would eventually notice too, and none of them could be trusted to handle that discovery gently. Heroes in every old story he'd ever read shared one grim pattern in common. They rarely stayed. They rarely survived long, once the world realized exactly what they were capable of. Sylvia suggested, carefully, that perhaps the boy needed protecting from that kind of attention, rather than exposed to it, at least until they understood more about what he truly was. Patrick didn't answer right away. He sat with the suggestion for a long while, staring into the cold, empty hearth of his study, weighing the safety of a grandson he'd only just begun to genuinely care about, against a world that had never once shown mercy toward anyone, extraordinary enough to stand out. Neither of them said the word aloud that night, but both were beginning to suspect the same impossible thing. Whatever Lion Asterie actually was, he was not simply a failed heir who had gotten lucky with a few potions. And somewhere out in that garden, still unaware of the conversation happening behind his back, Lion knelt over a patch of newly discovered herbs, his blessed hoe glinting faintly in the afternoon light, already turning his attention toward the next ingredient he needed to find.